her mic's live and she starts talking to you. Yeah. So just to like be careful.
The Subcommittee on Health will now come to order. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Our subcommittee continues its work to lower drug prices for seniors and for families across our country. Last month, the members of this subcommittee passed 6 bipartisan bills to make prescription drugs more affordable by increasing market competition. Today, we're going to take a close look at the Medicare program to understand what is leading to high prescription drug costs for the 60 million Americans who get their drugs through Medicare. To inform our work, we are privileged to have Dr. Matthews, the Executive Director of MedPAC, the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission. MedPAC provides valuable, nonpartisan advice to Congress on the Medicare program. We need expert advice. Drug prices are skyrocketing, and Congress must act and wants to act. Before we do, we have to, I believe, do as best we can to do a deep dive to understand the Medicare program and its challenges. Medicare accounts for 1 out of every $3 spent on prescription drugs, and drug spending is growing rapidly each year. Whether a patient gets their drugs at the hospital under the Part B program or the pharmacy counter through the Part D program, costs are rising. In the Part B program, Medicare drug spending doubled from 2009 to 2017. We spent $32 billion, that's with a B, on Part B drugs in 2017. Part D drug spending has also nearly doubled over the past 10 years. We spent $80 billion in the Part D program in 2017. These rising costs are putting, I believe, unsustainable pressure on the Medicare program and on America's families. In a recent Kaiser Family Foundation poll, 23% of seniors say it is difficult to afford their medications. I know it's true for my constituents and for all of my colleagues' constituents as well. We hear from people on a consistent basis that are worried that when they leave their doctor's office appointments with a new prescription written out for them, they're not sure whether they can pay for it, afford it, or not. America leads the world in innovative health care, but soon few people will be able to afford this cutting-edge care. This committee, through our work on the 21st Century Cures Act, promoted the development of novel breakthrough treatments. But with the development of these treatments has come increased spending. Spending on drugs in specialty tiers has grown nearly 1,000% over 10 years, from $3.4 billion in 2007 to $37.1 billion in 2017. Because Medicare has no limit on out-of-pocket spending, people who rely on specialty drugs are hit especially hard. One study found needing a single specialty drug could cause people on Medicare to spend anywhere from $2,000 to $16,000 out of pocket annually. Every senior deserves high-value, innovative medicine to improve their lives, but rapidly increasing costs affect their ability to get the drugs they need. So we need solutions. Today's hearing is yet another step closer to our, well, I would say it's a very important step toward our bringing forward solutions to what I just described. So welcome to Dr. Matthews. I look forward to your expert advice on improving the Medicare Part D program. And with that, I will now recognize Mr. Bhushan, who is taking the place of Dr. Burgess this morning, who has to be at the Rules Committee. Welcome, and it's nice to sit next to you.
Thank you. It's nice to sit next to you also. Madam Chairwoman, thank you for holding this important hearing today. I appreciate this opportunity for members to take a deeper look at the drug coverage offered to seniors under Medicare Part B and Part D. These programs provide critical health care coverage for American seniors, and getting a better understanding of where these programs are today will help ensure that they can meet the needs of seniors tomorrow. As we have been exploring drug pricing in this subcommittee and in the committee, this is an important opportunity to hear from the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, a nonpartisan organization that is tasked with providing technical advice to Congress. MedPAC is an important resource for Congress as we look to address challenging issues such as Medicare's ability to provide adequate and affordable drug coverage to seniors, and the impacts any programmatic changes may have on beneficiaries, providers, and taxpayers. Medicare Part B covers drugs that are administered by a physician through infusion or injection in an office or outpatient setting. These drugs include many high-cost chemotherapy agents and other critical life-saving medications. Medicare Part D provides a prescription drug benefit to beneficiaries, and participation is voluntary. The Part D program has been a success. According to a recent MedPAC report, it has improved beneficiaries' access to prescription drugs. Generic drugs now account for nearly 90% of the prescriptions filled. Enrollees' average premiums for basic benefits have remained around $30 per month for many years. More than 8 in 10 Part D enrollees report they are satisfied with the program. Furthermore, because of the deliberate structure of Part D, which incentivizes private health insurers to compete against one another, the program has been wildly successful in holding down costs to taxpayers. In 2016, Part D expenditures were approximately $100 billion, which was less than half of the $205.5 billion projected by the CBO in 2006. In fact, over the first 10 years that Part D was in operation, CBO data shows that the program cost taxpayers $555.8 billion less than originally projected. While Part B and Part D operate differently and cover different medications, they both provide seniors with access to necessary treatments and life-saving drugs. It is important that any suggested changes to these programs be well understood and the impacts on patients, providers, and taxpayers be carefully considered. The Trump administration has made a vow to lower costs of drugs and has proposed changes to both Medicare Part D, B, and D to address the rising list prices, out-of-pocket costs for patients, and costs to the federal government. These proposed changes to how Medicare operates and provides drugs under Part B and D should be carefully analyzed to understand their full impact. It is important that members of Congress on both sides of the aisle work together and with the administration find solutions to lower list prices and out-of-pocket costs while maintaining robust access for seniors without penalizing physicians, taxpayers, or stifling innovation. As the Energy and Commerce Committee considers legislative proposals to address the high cost of drugs, I appreciate the important resource that MedPAC provides Congress. I want to thank our witness, Dr. Matthews, for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his statement. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today we're continuing this committee's important work in providing Americans relief when it comes to the skyrocketing price of prescription drugs. We've already passed several bills that will remove barriers that delay cheaper generic drugs from coming to market, and today we're focusing on the rising costs of prescription drugs in the Medicare program so we can begin to think about solutions to drive down costs for America's seniors and for the federal government. We've all heard the stories about Americans who can't afford their medications, who are rationing their life-saving therapies or choosing not to fill their prescriptions because they instead need to put food on the table. And at the same time, we've watched as prescription drug spending continues to cost the federal government more and more each year, and we simply can't afford to wait any longer to fix this broken system. The way drug prices are set and the opaque drug supply chain has fostered a system that can be gamed for profit at the expense of seniors who need access to affordable medicines. I wanted to thank James Matthews, the Executive Director of MedPAC, for testifying. MedPAC is a critical resource to Congress and provides invaluable nonpartisan policy recommendations on how to improve the Medicare program for beneficiaries. And MedPAC has conducted significant work on prescription drug pricing in the Medicare program, and I look forward to hearing from Dr. Matthews on how we pay for drugs under Parts B and D and how we can lower drug costs. But this is particularly concerning in the Part D program, where high-cost specialty drugs represent a large and growing share of the Part D spending. According to MedPAC, spending for specialty drugs has grown more than 10 times since the beginning of the Part D program, and that growth resulted in specialty drug claims making up nearly a quarter of all gross Part D spending in 2017. And it's now estimated that between 2019 and 23, nearly two-thirds of newly launched drugs will be considered specialty drugs. These high-cost specialty drugs are partly responsible for the fact that each year, more beneficiaries are reaching the catastrophic phase of the Part D benefits. In 2016, over 360,000 Medicare beneficiaries reached the catastrophic limit of $4,850 out of pocket, that threshold, in just one visit to the pharmacy. That's a significant jump from only 33,000 beneficiaries in 2010, and this leaves beneficiaries, particularly those with serious chronic or life-threatening diseases, at risk for substantial out-of-pocket costs. So I look forward to hearing from Dr. Matthews about MedPAC's proposal to add an out-of-pocket limit to the Part D program. I hope we can work together on a bipartisan basis to implement some of these ideas in order to provide seniors with peace of mind that they'll be protected if they need these high-cost therapies. MedPAC has also noted that the current structure of the Part D program may be eroding incentives for prescription drug plans to control costs. Currently, the federal government pays 80% of the cost for Part D benefits in the catastrophic phase of coverage, and this means that payers may not be incentivized to effectively manage costs for the most expensive enrollees, since the government is footing most of the bill. We'll also discuss Part B drug spending, which has increased at an average rate of almost 10% annually for the past decade. These increases are primarily driven by rising drug prices, which have a direct impact on out-of-pocket costs for beneficiaries, because most beneficiaries are responsible for paying a 20% coinsurance on their Part B drugs. And so I look forward to examining proposals to slow rapid-paced growth and increase competition in the Part B drug program as well. And while most groundbreaking drugs are coming to market, and they really are saving lives and increasing quality of life and helping seniors to better manage diseases, but these therapies often come with price tags that are unaffordable for the average American. And these prices represent a significant long-term financial challenge to the federal government and to the Medicare program. So we have to find solutions that promote greater affordability and access, and I look forward to that discussion today. So I don't think anybody else wants my time, Madam Chair. I'll yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now is pleased to recognize Mr. Walden, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. This hearing continues this committee's important work on bringing down the cost of prescription drugs for seniors, frankly for all Americans and patients across the country, but especially seniors in the Medicare program. I want to thank our witness. Doctor, we're delighted to have you here as Executive Director of Medicare's Payment Advisory Commission, more commonly known as MedPAC. The work you do there and your team is really important. MedPAC provides a really valuable service to lawmakers, and as an independent, nonpartisan commission, provides data analysis and policy recommendations to improve the Medicare system, which we all care deeply about. We value this input, and we really appreciate the work of the commission. Today, we call on MedPAC's expertise with respect to rising prescription drug costs in the Medicare system. This committee has a long history on this issue, including the creation of Part D, which some of us were on the committee then and did the full overnight markup and 60 amendments and a lot of back and forth, but we got it done. That was back in '03. Nearly 44 million Medicare beneficiaries use Medicare Part D today. I remember there was talk then that nobody would write one of those plans. It'll never get off the ground. It'll cost a fortune. And actually, it's worked pretty well. Now, there are some tweaks all these years later we need to look at. It's important to note the overwhelming majority of seniors who have Part D are satisfied with their plan. Premiums have remained stable and, frankly, relatively low throughout the program's history. The program has largely been a good success, and harnessing the power of competition to create a working market has given consumers more choices than anybody thought possible and has helped keep prices down. Now, there are challenges to Medicare Part D that have grown over time and have saddled some beneficiaries with significant increases in their out-of-pocket costs. Additionally, the share of Medicare Part D spending attributable to the catastrophic stage of coverage has increased from 14% of the program costs in 2006 to 40% in 2017. So we should confront these issues now to modernize Part D and keep drugs affordable for seniors and address misaligned incentives that drive up costs. The same goes for Part B, where a small number of drugs represent a large percentage of government and beneficiary spending on the program. As others have noted, Part B drug spending has increased almost 10% per year since 2009. While there's been tremendous development of specialty drugs that can effectively treat cancer and other diseases in amazing ways, these rising costs must also be confronted. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses our witness on whether the current structure of how Part B drugs are reimbursed can and should be modified to foster competition and to lower prices. One consistent concern I hear from my constituents in Oregon, and I've done 20 town halls so far this year, is the high cost of prescription drugs. I know that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have heard similar concerns in their districts as well. We have worked in a bipartisan manner on lowering drug costs over the last several years. During my tenure as chairman of this committee and during the first few months of this year, we've continued those efforts. So I believe that that should continue, and this hearing will help us further our bipartisan work to lower drug costs for American consumers and seniors who rely upon Medicare. So thanks again, Doctor, for being here today and the good work you do at MedPAC. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. So get them in. I'd now like to introduce our witness for today's hearing, Dr. Jim Matthews. He serves as the Executive Director of the Medicare Payment Advisory Committee, and a very important position, a very important commission. Once again, thank you for being here today to be instructive to us, and we certainly look forward to your testimony. You've testified many times in Congress, so I don't think I need to explain the lighting system to you. The most important one is when it turns red, because that's when your 5 minutes are up. So Dr. Matthews, thank you again. You are now recognized for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairwoman Eshoo, Dr. Bhushan, and distinguished committee members. On behalf of MedPAC, a nonpartisan independent congressional advisory agency, I'm here to convey information on Medicare's payments for prescription drugs. First, I'll describe how Medicare pays for drugs under Part B and discuss recent trends in spending and utilization. Second, I'll do the same with Part D. Lastly, I'll touch briefly on Commission recommendations that address these trends. I'll start with Part B. Part B covers drugs that are typically administered by a provider, such as infused chemotherapy drugs. Medicare pays for Part B drugs based on the average sales price that manufacturers report for a drug, net of most rebates and discounts. Medicare pays providers the actual sales price plus a 6% add-on, regardless of how much the individual provider spent to purchase the drug. Medicare makes a separate payment to the provider for administering the drug. Part B drug spending has grown roughly 10% a year since 2009, reaching $32 billion in 2017. Growth in Medicare spending for drugs under Part B is driven largely by rising prices, which account for 2/3 of overall spending growth and which reflect manufacturers' significant pricing leverage. Under the current payment system, as drug prices rise, Medicare's payments will follow, and Medicare has few tools to affect prices under Part B. Part D uses private plans to deliver Medicare's outpatient prescription drug benefit. Part D plans negotiate with pharmacies over payment rates for filling prescriptions and with drug manufacturers for post-sale rebates. Medicare is prohibited from interfering in these negotiations. There are two components of Medicare's payments to plans for Part D basic benefits. First is a per-enrollee payment based on plans' bids, which reflect their expected costs of the Part D benefit for an average enrollee. The second is individual reinsurance, which are cost-based payments to plans through which Medicare covers 80% of the costs in the catastrophic phase of the benefit. Part D spending grew at about 7% annually between 2010 and 2017, reaching $80 billion. But Medicare's reinsurance payments for Part D enrollees who had drug spending high enough to reach the catastrophic phase grew almost 20% annually over this same period. Again, high-cost therapies drive these trends. Part D spending for high-priced specialty tier drugs grew tenfold between 2007 and 2017. And again, this growth is driven by price. In 2017, 370,000 beneficiaries filled a single prescription that was so expensive it would push them into the catastrophic phase of the benefit, up from just 33,000 such beneficiaries in 2010. When plans have financial responsibility for insurance risk, they face greater incentives to manage costs. However, growth in reinsurance, recent changes to the coverage gap, and the growth in high-cost medicines may be eroding plans' incentives to and ability to control costs. In fact, Part D's benefit structure may give plans a financial incentive to place certain high-cost, high-rebate drugs on their formularies, even when lower-cost alternatives are available. Growth in drug prices substantially affects Medicare drug spending. This growth reflects both higher prices for existing products and the launch of new high-priced drugs. Yet again, Medicare has very limited influence over drug prices. Recent Commission recommendations attempt to address the growth in Medicare drug spending. In Part B, we would give clinicians an alternative to the buy-and-bill environment and provide incentives for them to use this approach. In Part D, we would shift more liability for costs in the catastrophic phase of the benefit to plans. In exchange, we would give plans more tools and flexibility to manage enrollees' utilization. We would also eliminate beneficiary cost sharing in the catastrophic phase. In sum, prescription drugs are essential to treating many medical conditions, and Medicare must ensure that beneficiaries have access to appropriate medication therapies. At the same time, high prices for drugs make it difficult to ensure this access while protecting the taxpayers and beneficiaries who fund the program. We hope the committee regards the Commission as a resource as you develop policies to address these critical issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. We've now concluded the opening statements, and we'll move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of Dr. Matthews, and I'll start by recognizing myself for five minutes. Again, thank you, Dr. Matthews. In my opening statement, I spoke about the increase in spending on specialty drugs, and you also have spent part of your testimony on specialty drugs in the Medicare Part D program and what that means for seniors. You point out that plans may not have the incentive or the ability to control the costs of specialty drugs. So what, can you restate for us what exactly MedPAC believes, what plans can do to better manage the cost of the new specialty drugs? And of course, it's not just Medicare being hit by the trend in high-cost drugs. We have, well, I have some other questions too. Maybe I should just put all my questions out and you can answer them. VA, Medicaid, and private plans, how are they managing this trend? How do other federal programs like the VA and TRICARE leverage their buying power for these products? And what's the effect of high-cost drugs? Well, we know what the effect of high-cost drugs on beneficiaries is. Does MedPAC have a recommendation relative to an out-of-pocket cap needed for Medicare drug costs? I know that you said that Medicare has very little authority relative to pricing, but you know, we want to examine everything, every angle of this rubric's cube. And so if we were to implement such a cap, how would that affect the incentive for drug makers and Part D plans that we discussed? So those are my questions, and have at us.
Sure. So, again, thank you for the invitation to testify. And just to clarify, this is my first testimony before Congress. So,
well, bravo. Not so bad, is it? Huh?
Not yet.
This is a friendlier hearing room. It's smaller, it's more personal. So share your wisdom and your expertise with us.
Sure. So your question has multiple components, and I'm going to try and get to all of them. First, as you know, Medicare has made a recommendation in 2016 and slightly modified that recommendation in 2018 to modify the structure of the Part D benefit. And the motivation behind this recommendation hinges on the entry of high-cost, high-rebate drugs into the Part D program, and that the incentives that the plans have to place those drugs on their formularies even when lower-cost alternatives are available. And the incentives are such that the plan can move a beneficiary into the catastrophic phase of the benefit, where the plan only has 15% liability for those costs under current law. The Medicare program is liable for 80%, which it makes on a retrospective cost basis. And so it is counter to the incentives that the plans have to actually manage the benefit above the catastrophic limit. Plans are not the only actor that might have a role in managing costs at that level. We have started to evaluate additional reforms to the structure of the Medicare Part D benefit that would contemplate a role for the manufacturer to have some financial responsibility above that catastrophic phase, in contrast to current law, where the manufacturer is liable for a 70% discount on brand name drugs within the coverage gap. We are contemplating whether or not the incentives might be better for beneficiaries and the program as a whole by shifting that liability above the catastrophic threshold.
Is there any benefit to the beneficiaries relative to rebates in this?
So we think that by aligning the incentives for the plans and manufacturers to bargain hard for costs and to manage utilization, that would probably have a more direct and immediate effect on the majority or the totality of Part D enrollees relative to rebates that have distorted effects with respect to any individual beneficiary's utilization and costs.
And the other, how the other programs, private plans, Medicaid, VA, how are they managing this trend? How do they leverage their buying power for these products?
So Medicaid has a couple of tools available to the program. And again, I am not deep on Medicaid. My expertise is primarily Title 18, so I don't want to stray too far out of what I'm able to talk about. But Medicaid benefits from a statutory discount and also from a certain inflation rebate that governs how much manufacturers can increase their prices. VA is able to contract directly with manufacturers and suppliers under the federal supply schedule. They can do so because they actually take delivery of products and can guarantee utilization. But it's my understanding that sometimes VA has been criticized in that they have a closed formulary that in some cases has precluded access to certain innovative medications.
Well, my time has certainly expired, so now I'd like to recognize Mr. Bhushan, who is standing in for the subcommittee ranking member for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Dr. Matthews, MedPAC in the past has recommended a voluntary market-based program for doctors to use third-party vendors to obtain drugs in Part B. The administration, in its advance notice of proposed rulemaking, proposes setting up a similar system but would make it mandatory for physicians to participate. I've heard concerns from providers that requiring them to switch to vendors could be very disruptive. Can you discuss why MedPAC opted for a voluntary program and what features you included to foster competition on drug pricing?
Sure. One of the main reasons that led us to recommend a vendor-based approach to Part D drugs was the potential inflationary incentives inherent in Part B, where the higher the cost of the drug, the higher the 6% add-on that the provider who administers the drug receives from the program. And the research is fairly limited as to whether or not providers are actively acting on those incentives, but nonetheless, the incentives are still there. And we feel that getting providers out of the financial incentives related to buy and bill would be better served by having them focus more on selecting the drugs that are most appropriate to the given patient. And so we have recommended a modernization of the prior competitive acquisition program that Medicare used several years back, under which a vendor would be responsible for negotiating prices with manufacturers, and the vendor would be able to pass on those prices to the individual clinicians or providers who prescribe drugs under Part B.
Can I ask a question there? Because if you add another middle person so there might be some savings, but you're gonna eat some of that up, right?
Under our construct, there would be a couple of parameters that would govern the ability of a provider to eat up those savings. One, under our construct, savings would accrue to the vendor, and savings would also accrue to the clinicians who voluntarily elected to participate in that vendor's negotiated prices. The second thing that we would do...
So that'd be the difference between voluntary and mandatory then, essentially, right?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay.
The second thing we would do is, under our recommendation, we would have a requirement that the vendor negotiate prices no higher than 100% of ASP as currently pertains to the market. So there would be a couple of ways to govern any potential price increases on the Medicare.
Well, couldn't you just do that? Couldn't we just do that without a vendor in the middle? We could just say that's been tried, right? There was a demonstration project.
Yes,
in the previous administration, cutting it down to ASP plus, I think, 2-point-some%. I can't remember.
So the current sequester effectively reduces Medicare's payments for Part B drugs from the statutory ASP plus 6 to ASP plus 4.3%.
Yeah. Okay. The demonstration project which didn't happen, was
Right.
even lower than that.
Right.
I got another question, so I'm gonna move on from that. But first of all, as a physician, I think there automatically is assumption that physicians out there will choose a higher price product to make more money, and I'll just push back on that and say that I think there are maybe people that would do that. But I would argue that the vast majority of physicians make decisions on which medications to use for patients based on known clinical knowledge base and standard of care in their community. I just want to say that up front. But there are incentives, not disagreeing with that. In MedPAC's recommendations for Part D, it suggests that plan sponsors be given more financial incentives to manage the benefits of high-cost enrollees by shifting more of the plan payments from open-ended reinsurance to capitated payments. As part of this suggestion, plan sponsors would be given more flexibility to use formulary tools, in quotation marks. As a physician, I've had some problems with those formulary tools, such as step therapy and prior authorization, for many years. That could delay patient access to timely medications, disrupt treatment regimens for stable patients, and create unnecessary physician burden. Did MedPAC consider these potential impacts to patients and physicians before providing this recommendation?
Yes, sir, we did. And as always, there is a balance or a set of trade-offs involved in these kinds of decisions, where you want to give the plans the leverage with manufacturers to negotiate prices and incentives to manage utilization versus any potential speed bumps that those tools put in front of providers and patients in terms of timely access to the medications. So we have talked with stakeholders in the course of developing our recommendations, and we do understand the frustration that some of these utilization management tools create, but at the same time, it's a question of the trade-offs and the balance that we are trying to achieve for the program as a whole.
Okay, great. Thank you. My time's expired, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and he yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, full committee chairman, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I wanted to kind of follow up on some of the things that you mentioned, Madam Chair. Let me start with Part D. MedPAC has analyzed that between 2007 and 17, Part D program spending increased from $46 billion to about $80 billion for an average increase of 5.6% per year, which I think is unsustainable. So, Dr. Matthews, can you explain why we're seeing these steep spending increases in Part D? And it's my understanding that a smaller portion of high-cost beneficiaries are driving the majority of Part D spending, and is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct. As one of the members said in the opening statements, Part D has been successful in shifting a substantial amount of utilization among Part D enrollees to generics, which the Commission has supported. But at the same time, we are seeing the entry of new high-cost specialty drugs into the program. And over the last several years, it is those drugs that have been predominantly driving the increases in spending that we've documented.
Now, I know you talked a little bit about some of MedPAC's solutions to control spending in response to Chairman Eshoo, but would you develop that a little more? What are some of MedPAC's solutions to control spending in the future?
Okay, so again, under Part D, one of the key elements that we would do is restructure the benefit to give plans more of an incentive to manage utilization above the catastrophic limit. We feel that having the program be responsible for 80% of those costs above the catastrophic limit is inconsistent with the notion that Part D was founded on, which was that Part D plans would compete with manufacturers in order to generate the best possible price for the enrollees in order to keep premiums low. So we feel that the incentives currently have negated plans' ability to do that somewhat. As we've been discussing the growth in Medicare spending for drugs under Parts B and D since then, we've become more attuned to the influence of these new high-cost therapies, and we are starting, as I said earlier, to contemplate whether or not manufacturers who do indeed control the price should have a greater liability for spending in the catastrophic phase of the benefit. Again, the Commission has not made any formal recommendations there yet, but it is something that we are very actively engaged in doing.
All right, now let me get into two more questions. This is the last one on Part D, then I want to ask about Part B. You talked about generics. You know, we're very proud of the fact that on a bipartisan basis, we reported out a package of generic competition bills that I think are going to go to the floor soon. But of course, if you have these single-source drug therapies, there's no competition, right? So we know often that these innovative products can change lives as single source, but without competition, how difficult is it to control the cost of those therapies in particular?
We believe it is difficult, and that is one factor that has led us to contemplate going further than our 2016 benefit restructuring recommendation. And again, here the recommendation was to have plans liable for 80% of those costs. But if we are talking about true sole source products for which there are no competitors, the plans are going to have fairly limited negotiating leverage with which to negotiate hard on price with the manufacturers. And that's why we are starting to contemplate whether or not the manufacturer should have some liability for costs above the catastrophic phase.
All right, now let me just issue Part D. I was struck by the rate of rapid annual growth in Part D drugs mentioned in your testimony, almost 10% spending increases annually for the past decade. So one question, could you provide some examples of the most expensive drugs in the Part B program and the conditions they treat, and what are some of the annual per user costs for these drugs, and what's the beneficiary's responsibility for these costs?
Sure, and just to clarify, this is B?
B now. This is my only question about B. Yeah.
Yes, of course. So again, a lot of the high-cost drugs that we've been seeing over the last several years are high-cost specialty drugs, predominantly biologics. All of the top 10 drugs for Part B in terms of spending are biologics. They are used to treat conditions such as cancer and its side effects, rheumatoid arthritis, and ocular conditions such as macroocular degeneration.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the gentleman, and he yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, the full committee ranking member, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And again, Doctor, thank you for the work you do and your team. We know that a lot of surveys show seniors like Medicare Part D and like a 90% approval rating. But we also see some disturbing trends, and I wanted to ask you about some of that. I hear a lot about the rising out-of-pocket costs for seniors, and I have some concerns that some of the changes to Part D program provide incentives to use brands over generics, and particularly as it relates to true out-of-pocket costs, the acronym TROOP calculation. So if a senior used only generics, they would have to spend about $5,100 to reach the catastrophic stage of coverage, correct?
Yes, sir, that sounds about right.
And so due to the way TROOP is calculated, I'm told a senior would have to spend only $2,275 in a year to reach catastrophic coverage if they used only brands. Is that?
Without commenting on the specific dollar amounts, I believe the proportions are correct.
Okay. And how have these incentives then affected Part D formularies and plan design? I mean, what's happening in this?
So we do see a trend where plans have in certain instances, included high-cost, high-rebate drugs on their formularies, even when lower-cost alternatives are available. And the idea here is that the high-cost drug is going to get the beneficiary into the coverage gap sooner than a lower-cost brand name drug or a lower-cost generic, and it's above the coverage gap in the current construct where the plan only has 15% liability for those costs. And so arguably there are instances where the size of the rebate for certain drugs can be so great as to even begin to offset their 15% liability above that catastrophic limit.
So what's the effect for taxpayers and what's the effect for consumers of that?
So for taxpayers, again, the fastest growing component of Medicare spending for Part D is the reinsurance payments that the program makes to plans. And these are payments that reflect plans' costs for these extremely high-cost enrollees, but these payments are also funded directly by the Medicare program. So the fact that these reinsurance payments have been growing for 20% year over year for the last 10 years is detrimental to taxpayers, and to the extent that these costs are reflected in the calculation of Part B premiums, it is detrimental for the beneficiaries who are paying for these premiums.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
And thank the gentleman. Yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, my friend, Congresswoman Matsui.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Matthews, for joining us today. While it's important to focus on lowering the price of prescription drugs for patients and to ensure the sustainability of the Medicare program, we can't lose sight of the need to protect beneficiaries' access to necessary medications. As you know, the administration last fall proposed changes to the protected class policy that would allow Part D plan sponsors to add restrictions or otherwise limit prescription medications in the 6 protected classes. The protected classes policy is an important safety net for patients who absolutely need potentially life-saving medications to treat a complex medical conditions. I'm particularly concerned that changing protected class policy will jeopardize Medicare beneficiaries' access to the full range of medicines for treating mental illness. For example, antidepressant medication impacts individuals differently, and as such can take time to find the right treatment that works for any given individual. And earlier this month, I led a letter of my colleagues to CMS expressing this concern. Dr. Matthews, I understand that MedPAC has recently considered similar changes to 2 of the 6 protected classes, including antidepressants. Given my concern around access for Medicare's most vulnerable beneficiaries, I'm interested in your thoughts on how we can continue to ensure the availability of needed medications while making changes to the protected classes.
Sure, yes, ma'am, I'm happy to address that. As part of our 2016 recommendations on Part D, we did recommend removing 2 categories of drugs from the protected classes, one of which was antidepressants. The second one was immunosuppressives used after transplant surgery. The rationale here was that there do seem to be enough alternatives in those 2 categories that plans could be able to put together a formulary that accommodated the clinical needs of most beneficiaries needing those drugs without being constrained by having to cover every drug in those protected classes. The administration's proposal is a little bit different. I don't think they have recommended eliminating any of the protected classes, but have proposed giving plans more ability to use utilization management within those classes. But again, you know, the balance here is beneficiary access relative to plans' ability to negotiate with manufacturers for price. And if the plan has to cover every single drug in a protected class, they have virtually no leverage in order to negotiate with a manufacturer. So it's those trade-offs that led us to the recommendation. The last thing I would say is we would, in either instance, in our recommendation or with respect to the administration's proposal, we would believe that there is a strong need for a well-functioning appeals process that beneficiaries can avail themselves of.
I agree, yeah, that'd be good, but on the other hand, you know, we've had experience with people with mental illness, and in particular, as you know, the therapy involved there, it's very difficult to get the right medication and then to have to go back again to start over since they already know that's not going to work anyway. And I just really hope that whatever process you decide to implement is really going to be very sensitive to that, because we hate to lose the ability for individuals who already found a therapy to be able to continue it in some way.
Yes, we are keenly aware of the unique nature of treatments for behavioral disorders.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about out-of-pocket spending for beneficiaries in Medicare Part D, and I'm concerned about patient access issues created by the fact that Part D program does not currently have an out-of-pocket limit. Means that some seniors who have significant drug spending, often those with chronic diseases or those who are severely ill, will continue to pay a cost-sharing obligation even in the catastrophic phase and even after spending thousands of dollars out of pocket. I know that MedPAC has recommended reforming the Part D benefit to eliminate cost-sharing above the out-of-pocket threshold. Can you explain MedPAC's recommendations to cap out-of-pocket expenses for Part D beneficiaries and how this change might impact premiums and other aspects of the benefit design? And I only have about 15 seconds here.
Sure. So we did indeed recommend in 2016 capping the beneficiary's financial obligation above the catastrophic phase. The motivation was that if a beneficiary is incurring that kind of cost, coinsurance is not a drag on inappropriate utilization, but it is potentially punitive at that point from the beneficiary's financial perspective.
Okay. I yield back my time. Thank you.
And thank the gentlewoman. She yields back. I now would like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I want to thank you for having this hearing today. Dr. Matthews, welcome. We appreciate your input, and it's very, very helpful. We just need to take action, and that's what this hearing is. I also appreciated your comments on trying to clarify the how's VA different. I know that's kind of out of your window, but that there's a formulary, and so the formulary is narrow, so even our veterans may not get the full scope of drugs available in our country because they're purchasing and making contracts. We always have to try to explain that in this process because sometimes it gets lumped together and say, well, why can't you do it that way? And I guess if you got lower cost, that's good, but if you don't get the drug, the blockbuster drug, then it's bad. So then there's that balance. I also appreciated talking just Medicare D. What benefit was provided to our seniors for help and prescription drugs prior to Medicare D?
There was no real
There was-
outpatient prescription drug benefit.
There was none. So, I mean, again, for the instruction purpose, we wrestled with how to get Medicare. In fact, a lot of conservative Republicans got beat up quite a bit on this because we expanded, in essence, an entitlement and mandatory spending program. But modern medicine said prescription drugs has to be part of the fix. I know the chairman has left, but we had some great fights and debates and battles. And Chairman Pallone was most angry about the donut hole provisions, which we placed in there for budgetary to make the numbers work. So I was surprised when I met with a constituent, because I don't follow this as closely as you all do. And we have a new world of drugs on the market prior to what we did in 2003. They're life-saving drugs. They're biologics. They are, especially the new blockbuster drugs, are very, very expensive. So I had a constituent who provided me with this, a biologic. It's actually, and I wrote down what was it? What does this do? Enzyme, what? Come up here so you can tell me. All right, enzyme deficiency. So this is at a cost a year of $348,000. So then I was kind of going through how Medicare D got established, and I drew the donut hole. I said, you pay here, you fall into the donut hole, you got to pay it all. And then it was our intent that once you came out of the donut hole, that you'd be covered. So I think some of your proposals are trying to address what, the answers to Doris and Congresswoman Matsui's concerns about end-of-pocket costs. And then I was surprised when he provided me information that the percentage cost. So if this is $348,000 over a year, $22,000 a month, they're still on the hook for a percentage of that.
Yes, sir. That's correct.
So that those of us who were in that room in 2003 thought that once they got out of the donut hole, they'd kind of gotten home free. That's not true, is it?
No, sir, it's not.
Yeah, it's not true for my constituent either. So I appreciate him meeting me. We actually met in a bar, as I was traveling through my district. It's very large. Yeah, we did have to have a few drinks after I heard that cost of that they were having to burn. So we need to address this, this major expense. And if a Medicare D is supposed to be an insurance plan, and then there's a catastrophic portion, there's eventually a time when, and I think that's your reinsurance provision and those other proposals. Am I correct?
That's correct. Yes, sir.
So I just thank you for being here. My understanding that you are an independent agency and you advise us. So I would hope, Madam Chairman, that we would take your counsel and try to address, especially this end of the process, because Medicare D does seniors pay in. I mean, so they're part of the solution. They're not just not all government solution because it's an insurance plan that they are partners with, and they choose. We need to help them on the back end. So with that, I appreciate your time. Thanks, Madam Chairman, and my time's expired.
Thank the gentleman. Excellent questions. I now would like to recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Schrader, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate it. Dr. Matthews, thanks for, I need some medication myself. Thank you for taking the time to be here. As you may or may not know, my state of Oregon is taking steps to increase the number of payments tied to performance in Medicaid. Specifically, they're using an 1115 waiver work with our coordinated care organizations and network providers to create a plan to hit a value-based payment by 2022. Other states are also trying to set up these arrangements. Has MedPAC evaluated either in specific cases or more broadly whether Medicare may benefit from value-based arrangements tying the reimbursement to actual outcomes? What, if any, barriers are in the way for that?
So we are aware of the emergence of these types of value-based arrangements, both here in the United States and in European countries. It's my understanding that the evidence on the long-term effectiveness of these arrangements simply does not yet exist, that these are new enough that a broad base of evidence hasn't been generated to ascertain that they can exercise the potential that the stakeholders believe is there. With respect to Medicare, one potential impediment to the broad use of these sorts of value-based arrangements is the voluntary nature of Part D. So a plan may enter into an agreement with a manufacturer that is contingent on certain beneficiary outcomes that may not manifest themselves until after the lapse of a period of years, but Part D is a voluntary benefit, and a beneficiary can move from one plan to the next year after year. And so a plan may not see the benefits of its investment in these arrangements for a particular enrollee. So that's one potential logistical obstacle in Part D as currently designed.
A good point. With regard to the general Medicare population, you spoke in your testimony about the low-income beneficiaries disproportionately selecting brand drugs sometimes over generic, actually oftentimes brand over generic. What remedy for increasing the utilization of generics by this population would you recommend? I know that there's administrations out there trying just to lower the cost of the brand to the generic to zero to make it appealing. What about increasing the cost of the brand? Do you have a thought?
So we have gone on record as recommending that even low-income or beneficiaries receiving the low-income subsidy should be given incentives to use generics when they are available and clinically appropriate. As you just mentioned, those incentives can take one of two forms. One is zero copayments or zero financial liability for generics. The second would be some nominal financial liability for the use of brand name drugs when generics are available. And we think that even low-income beneficiaries should have to make those kinds of decisions with respect to the therapies that they and their clinicians decide on.
So no, you don't have an opinion as to whether it's just reducing one?
Either would achieve the goal of increasing low-income beneficiaries' use of generics.
All right, very good, thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. He yields back. I now would like to recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this meeting, and thank you for being here, doing a good job for good job. Even if it's your first time, I've almost said a good job for your first time, but a good job. I appreciate it very much. And unfortunately, we should coordinate better with my neighbor in the hallway, Mr. Schrader, because he asked almost word for word one of the questions I was going to ask. So I want to get to the value base. That's interesting to me. But so are you supportive of transparency tools like real-time prescription benefit check that can help beneficiaries understand the cost of their prescribed medications before they leave the doctor's office?
Yes, sir. We have been supportive of clinicians' use of electronic tools like real-time benefit check.
So what policies do you think we should develop to encourage the use of these tools?
I would need to think about that with all due respect. It's my understanding that the technology does exist with respect to currently available electronic health records, but the issue is getting the incentive, the clinician to actually purchase the requisite models or modules to do the real-time benefit check and providing incentives for clinicians to use those. But the Commission does not have a specific proposal in order to do that.
Okay, thank you. And changing gears, since Mr. Schrader took my thunder, I said I'm told that a physician charges for administering drugs are twice as much in hospitals compared to doctors' offices. This drives up Medicare costs, but also drives up cost sharing for the patients. Can more be done to address this through site-neutral payment reform?
Yes, sir. I believe there is more that can be done. As you know, the Commission has been concerned about the incentives or the undesirable incentives that occur with respect to the differential for a clinician's services in the physician office versus the hospital outpatient department, and we've made recommendations to standardize those payments across settings. Yet, nevertheless, we think that those incentives still exist and that there are potential broader remedies that could be contemplated.
Okay, thank you, and again, thanks for being here today and holding the hearing, and I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield for a few seconds?
I'll yield, is that the remainder of my time to Mr. Bhushan, Dr.
Yeah,
Bhushan?
I just want to make a brief comment on what he was talking about the patients knowing up front what prices drugs are. When I was in practice, if I was going to prescribe something I knew might cost a lot, I actually checked myself personally before I would prescribe it for the patient just to make sure. But I do think in today's electronic world that physicians should be able to determine that up front. And sometimes, depending on the patient, that may very well make you make different decisions on what the options are, because if the out-of-pocket's going to be real high for the patient, there might be therapeutic alternatives. So I do think we can get to a place where electronic records can provide that information at a minimum to the provider. I think when you go to the consumer, it's more confusing, but for the provider, I think that could help. So, yeah, it could pop up on the screen, for example, when you go to send an electronic prescription. So I yield.
Thank the gentleman, and he yields. I now would like to recognize the gentleman from California, Dr. Ruiz, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. Dr. Matthews, I appreciate the position that the Commission is in, trying to make recommendations that balance the need to cut down on healthcare costs while also ensuring that patients are getting the care that they need. And I know that patient care is important to you. In your written testimony, you identify one of the Commission's goals is achieving a Medicare program that ensures beneficiary access to high-quality, well-coordinated care, unquote. Last November, CMS proposed a rule that would allow Medicare Advantage plans to use step therapy for Medicare Part B drugs. And while I understand that step therapy can play an important role in reducing healthcare costs, it often does not take into account a patient's medical history, like whether they have tried the medication previously and failed under a different insurance plan. Fred San Giorgio, one of my constituents from La Quinta, California, suffers from psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis and is going through step therapy right now. He has been diagnosed most of his adult life and has tried several treatments over the years. Despite the fact that he already tried one treatment that didn't work, he is currently being forced to go through a similar treatment that his doctor knows won't be effective. Instead of being able to prescribe an alternative treatment that she thinks will be more effective, his doctor has to wait for this drug to fail too, despite the fact that both of them know that what's going to happen. That's why I have introduced legislation with my friend Congressman Wenstrup, a fellow physician, that would help protect the doctor-patient relationship and help get patients the care that they need. The Safe Step Act creates a list of exemptions that will allow patients to bypass steps therapy if their doctor knows that the treatment will not be successful, as is the case with Fred. As a physician, I want to ensure that all step therapy protocols also include safeguards to help ensure that patients aren't forced to have to try a treatment that their provider knows is not likely to work for them, or even to take a drug that may have already failed for them in the past. So can you outline some safeguards that CMS can put into place to protect the patients from unnecessary and potential harmful treatments?
Yes, sir. So again, the Commission has gone on record as supporting giving plans more flexibility to appropriately use these management tools. We do understand that the circumstances of every patient is unique, and that we would not support putting a patient through some of these things like step therapy when the clinician knows that they are not going to be effective for a given patient. And therefore, we have said that the greater use of these tools has to be accompanied by a very robust and effective system of grievances and appeals, whereby a clinician can request an expedited.
So what are some of these exceptions that you would propose to safeguard patient access?
So if the clinician is able to document that the patient has previously failed on a therapy that is required by a plan's formulary or step therapy, or
And what does failed mean to you?
that the patient's clinical condition has not responded to the treatment that is being required by the plan.
Does a lack of compliance due to cumbersome regimens, like a, every 4-hour treatment, and therefore that doesn't fit that person's life or work schedule, would that be considered failure to you?
I do not have the clinical basis to answer that question with all due respect, and the commission hasn't opined at that level of detail.
Well, in my medical opinion, when it's a compliance issue, it's usually a failure in the system to provide the best treatment and follow-up for that patient. It's not the patient's fault per se, which is normally what happens in the medical world. So what other safeguards could we think of that would provide these exceptions so that we can preserve the patient's and the physician's judgment in getting them the medication that's best for that patient, instead of putting them through a rigorous bureaucratic step process in order to save the company money?
Again, if I could ask for the dispensation to think about that and follow up.
Okay. What's the MedPAC strategy to both monitor beneficiary impact and to ensure CMS institutes appropriate safeguards, including those that are aligned with a number of state-based laws which serve as models for the Safe Step Act?
So we believe that the Medicare program is currently monitoring beneficiaries' appeals under Part D. There are a number of steps that patients and their clinicians can go through, and it's my understanding that the majority of those appeals are indeed adjudicated in favor of the patients when clinically warranted. So the agency is indeed monitoring whether or not beneficiaries' access to medications under Part D is being unduly compromised.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I now would like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Madam Chair, appreciate it very much. Thanks for holding this very important hearing. Appreciate it. Dr. Matthews, with Florida's traditionally higher senior population, lowering prescription drug prices, as you can imagine, and Medicare is very important to me. As noted in MedPAC comments on the International Pricing Index, or IPI for short, last year, the Drug Value Program recommended previously by MedPAC would give vendors tools to negotiate lower prices. Under the administration's IPI proposal, they don't include these tools. So it seems like instead the government is just setting the price directly. Am I correct in concluding that MedPAC's proposal is more market-based than the administration's?
I would not want to comment on whether or not the competing proposals are more market-based, one relative to the other. We did identify a number of potential logistical issues with respect to the administration's proposal that we believe would make it very difficult to implement. And these range from things such as the one you just mentioned, that the vendor would not have any tools such as a formulary or other mechanisms by which to negotiate with manufacturers. The vendor under the administration's model would take title to the drugs, but perhaps not actual physical possession. And then lastly, the vendor would be paid at a rate determined by Medicare based on the international price comparison, whether or not they were able to obtain that rate on the market or not. And we identified a number of issues that would affect the ability to even calculate that international sales rate, given available data and given the idiosyncratic arrangements between manufacturers and you know, other countries' governments. So we think there are some substantial implementation difficulties with respect to the IPI proposal that do not present themselves under our proposal, which would give the vendor more ability to negotiate on the basis of being able to help drive manufacturers' volume.
Excuse me, Dr. Matthews, I've just learned that your voice is not carrying well on TV, so can you bring your microphone much closer?
Sure.
And then maybe the staff hearing me will come back in and let us know if you can be heard. Thank you.
Sure. I'm sorry. So I was indicating that under our proposal, that some of the difficulties engendered by the IPI proposal would be mitigated, and we believe that it would have greater potential to reduce spending for Part B drugs.
Very good. I know there are examples in the market where arbitration is used, such as baseball. I'm a big baseball fan. But developing breakthrough medicine is a lot different from developing starting pitching, and legislating a government-defined arbitration process is a lot different from negotiating one through a players' union.
Yes, sir.
Are there examples of binding arbitration between being used in healthcare, and do any of these examples involve setting prices at a national level or just resolving disputes at an individual level?
Move your microphone even closer, please.
Pull it right up.
Yeah,
Okay.
pull it right up.
This is not a natural thing for me to be doing, so I apologize.
Well, that's all right. We'll guide you. It's just a microphone. Get it as close as possible so
All right.
that anyone in the country that's listening in can actually hear you.
Yeah, that's not helping, but I'll,
Okay.
I'll proceed. So we are unaware of the use of baseball arbitration in the way we've proposed it for Part B.
Can you describe how you've proposed it, the
Right.
arbitration?
So as I mentioned, both in my written testimony and in my oral remarks, one of the vulnerabilities of the Medicare program is that it has little, if any, ability to influence the price that the manufacturer sets for a product and therefore the price that Medicare pays. And we believe that binding arbitration would give the program a means of influencing that price by bringing the manufacturer to the table with their absolute best offer for a new product. And then the secretary would be able to make a competing offer if he or she did not think that the evidence supported that manufacturer's price. And that this would be distinct from a scenario where the secretary is negotiating directly with manufacturers for price, in that only certain drugs that met criteria defined under statute or regulation would trigger this binding arbitration process. But currently, the Medicare program has virtually no means whatsoever to influence price. And as I've said in my testimony under both B and D, price is one of the major drivers of Medicare spending for drugs.
Very good. Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
So,
The gentleman yields back, and I now would like to recognize the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Congresswoman Custer.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for your discussion. It's actually very, very helpful on a complicated topic. So in New Hampshire, there are nearly 300,000 Medicare beneficiaries, and most of them, many of them, do have Medicare Part D prescription drug coverage. But the prices that Granite Staters are facing for prescription drugs are, to say it bluntly, unacceptable and frankly unsustainable. They're unsustainable for aging communities that rely on Medicare to be there for them when they turn 65, and for the taxpayers whose hard-earned dollars go toward the different payment mechanisms that you've walked us through today. So I'm going to cut to the chase. I want to understand specifically on the buy and bill program. Under the current Part B system, a provider is reimbursed at 106% of the average sales price regardless of the actual price that they pay for the drug. And so my question is, some providers may be getting the drug at a price below the average, and it's possible that some at a price above the average. Could you explain the original intent behind the 100% plus 6 add-on payment, and what information is available on the provider's actual acquisition costs, what they pay for the drug?
Okay, sure. I'll try to answer without deigning congressional intent behind the 6% add-on. The answer to the question, in all candor, is not clear. There are a number of competing alternative explanations for 6%. One is that the 6% helps compensate clinicians and providers for the costs of administering the drug, but as I mentioned earlier, Medicare pays the clinician
But they get
separately
a separate
for that.
payment.
That's
for that.
correct.
Right.
So I don't think that explanation is quite right. Another explanation is that the 6% compensates for the provider's costs related to handling and storing the drug or waste that occurs during the administration of the drug. But again, under both the outpatient prospective payment system and the physician fee schedule, there are components of those payments that reflect providers' costs of basically running the operation. So I don't think that's
the normal overhead.
That's
the
exactly
operation.
right. Yes, ma'am. And so the most compelling explanation from my perspective is that, as you just pointed out, not every purchaser is able to get the drug at the average price. Some are paying more, some are paying less. And to the extent that volume is driving a provider's ability to obtain a good price, some small independent practitioners, rural physicians, small hospitals may not be getting quite as good a deal as larger health systems. And so the 6% add-on could be reflecting the relative purchasing provider power based on volume.
So I'm glad you brought up volume, and my goal is to have the lowest price for the senior and the lowest price for the taxpayer. And I think right now it's safe to say seniors are paying too much, taxpayers are paying too much. So my question is, has MedPAC ever examined the impact on the cost of medications to beneficiaries in the Medicare program by authorizing Health and Human Services Secretary to negotiate a volume discount on prescription drugs? And have you ever provided recommendations? Could you tell us? I just don't understand everywhere else. I've sat for 6 years on the Veterans Affairs Committee. I know what federal employees, I know what Walgreens, and my constituents don't understand why wouldn't we have a volume discount for the purchase of medication under Medicare?
The Commission has not taken a position on this issue, nor have we made any recommendations.
So we don't know. It could bring down the cost for both the taxpayers and seniors.
I don't know that I would opine on that myself, because the notion of a volume discount in some ways raises the question of the Secretary negotiating with manufacturers and basically saying, I, the Medicare program, am going to guarantee a certain amount of volume of your drug, and therefore you need to give me this volume discount or this lower price. And again, the Commission has not taken a position with respect to the Secretary's ability to influence price through direct negotiation.
I would simply say in every other aspect, that's how we bring down the price, is negotiating a volume discount. So I very much appreciate your candor, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. I now would like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Matthews, for being here, and thank you for the work that you do in leading MedPAC and helping and doing your best to keep prices down, as well as providing the best services that we can to the recipients of Medicare. It's extremely important. earlier this month, in this committee, and in a bipartisan fashion, I was able to pass legislation that I sponsored, bipartisan legislation, along with Representative Giaforte, Representative O'Harian, Representative Welch, called the Payment Commission Data Act.
Yes, sir.
Which is going to allow MedPAC, as you know, to be able to get data relating to prescription drug pricing, and you in turn will be able to use that data to make recommendations to us here in Congress. Can you just comment on that firsthand, on how that may be able to help you?
Yes, sir. And before I do, I would want to express on behalf of the Commission my appreciation to you and the other co-sponsors of this legislation. One of the ways that the Commission has been hamstrung in terms of being able to evaluate the effects of the various rebate structures on the Medicare program and its beneficiaries is we do not have access to that level of granular data with respect to rebates on a prescription-by-prescription or drug-by-drug basis. And so, for example, when we commented on the Office of Inspector General's recent proposal to eliminate rebates in the Medicare program, we were only able to evaluate that proposal through its aggregate impacts on the program, on beneficiaries and manufacturers. We simply did not have the level of detail in order to be able to assess it would affect this group of beneficiaries who are taking this class of medications for this variety of conditions. And so having this more granular data on rebates would help us do those kind of analyses and help inform the kinds of deliberations that the committee is having on a regular basis.
Right, and I certainly think both of us would be remiss if we did not mention that information is only going to go to you. You're the only ones who are going to see it. It's not, we get it, it's proprietary information, but it's not going to be released to the public. It'll only go to the commission.
That is correct, sir. MedPAC has a sterling track record in terms of handling proprietary and sensitive data.
I want to ask you about DIR fees. You're familiar with DIR fees, and you're familiar with what the administration, what Health and Human Services, CMS specifically, has proposed in changing the rules so that DIR fees our discounts will go directly at the point of sale, as you mentioned earlier. But there were two things that you mentioned in your letter to the administration or to HHS about DIR fees. First of all, that DIR fees had grown from $229 million in 2013 to $4 billion in 2017. $229 million to $4 billion. And of course, for those of the people who don't know, DIR fees are essentially clawback fees that go to that the PBMs place on the pharmacies. You also mentioned that the amount of the DIR fees that the plan sponsors were recouping actually exceeded what they had proposed and what they had really had projected. Can you comment on or explain what that disparity might mean for cost sharing?
So yes, what the short answer is that this means beneficiaries at the point of sale are paying a much greater amount in cost sharing than they should be relative to the effective transaction price between the manufacturer and the plan.
Exactly. Exactly, and I know that MedPAC has put out some different solutions to the DIR fees, but the point is that you agree that DIR fees are a problem.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, good. Very quickly, in what little time I have left, of course, one of the things that we've been talking about on this committee and in Energy and Commerce and specifically on the O&I committee has been insulin pricing. And I just wanted you to comment very quickly that I understand there's a lot of variability in the different plans on how they cover insulin, but can you explain how does the Medicare plans cover insulin, particularly for those patients who are in the donut hole?
If I could get you to ask the question just slightly differently.
Well, in other words, I know the different Medicare Part D plans cover it in different ways, but making it affordable, making it accessible is something we're very concerned with, particularly on this committee. How can we do that? How can those plans do that in a better way?
Again, our recommendation to restructure the Part D benefit would mitigate the incentives for plans to use these high-cost, high-rebate drugs, and insulin is one example of those kinds of things. And by better aligning the plan's incentives, it would potentially reduce the influence of DIR on the cost that the beneficiary faces.
Right. Again, I want to thank you for your work, transparency and accountability within the system, particularly with the third party, the pharmacy benefit managers, the middleman. That's what's going to help us. And there, you know, transparency is the best disinfectant out there, and sunlight is, and that's why we need it so bad. So thank you for your work on this, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now would like to recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Judge Butterfield. And happy birthday to you again.
I've been multitasking today, and I don't have any questions.
You don't?
If you can believe that.
Isn't that something? Yeah. Well, a lot of good ones have been asked, so stay tuned. All right, well, with that, we'll move to the gentlewoman from Delaware, Ms. Blunt Rochester, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I'd also like to thank you, Dr. Matthews. I'm trying to speak into the mic now. I'm cognizant of it. Today's hearing is an opportunity for the subcommittee to continue our bipartisan work on lowering prescription drug costs by turning our attention to how skyrocketing prices are impacting Medicare Part B and D. And it couldn't happen at a more important time. Prescription drug spending accounts for nearly $1 out of every 5 spent on Medicare, and according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, was 19% of overall Medicare spending in 2016. The Office of the Actuary at CMS found that the national health expenditures will continue to increase by an annual average of 5.5% until 2027. These spending trends mean that it's not just the federal government that's paying more, but Medicare beneficiaries. And in my state, that means growing costs for the almost 200,000 Medicare beneficiaries. Dr. Matthews, I would like to discuss Medicare Part B's low-income subsidy, which helps provide beneficiaries with limited incomes assistance with their Part D premiums and out-of-pocket expenses. In 2018, 12.5 million beneficiaries with incomes at or below 100% of the federal poverty level received federal assistance. And in Delaware, 23% of beneficiaries received the low-income subsidy. However, MedPAC has found that relative to other Part D enrollees, a higher proportion of LIS enrollees use brand-name drugs. Can you explain why this is happening?
Okay, the dominant hypothesis that has guided our thinking here is that the low-income beneficiary whose costs are heavily subsidized is not as sensitive to cost sharing or the price of the drugs that they take relative to a beneficiary who is paying, you know, the full coinsurance and their full out-of-pocket liability. And so given the choice between a brand name drug and a generic, many Medicare patients who regard generics as not as good, a low-income beneficiary who is facing zero or minimal cost sharing is going to opt for the brand name when it's available.
Right. Opt for the one that they rationally think is the better product. Additionally, MedPAC found that in 2016, about 8% of Part D enrollees reached the out-of-pocket threshold. And of that 8% of high-cost enrollees, over 70% were LIS beneficiaries. And given that it is the Medicare program that pays the largest share of cost above the out-of-pocket threshold, I'm concerned that plans may be structuring their benefits in ways that shift costs to Medicare for these enrollees in order to shield plans from risk. Does MedPAC share these concerns?
Our concerns are more are even larger than that, not limited just to the low-income beneficiaries, but again, given the growth in the cost-based reinsurance payments for all Part D enrollees, we believe that is an extremely pressing problem for the program. And while In the earlier phases of the Part D benefit, LIS enrollees did reach the catastrophic phase at faster rates and in greater proportions. In recent years, it is the non-LIS population who is now hitting that cap at much higher rates.
I know one of the things that you discussed before were the incentives, you know, whether to incentivize beneficiaries to pick a cheaper alternative. Can you talk about the options that you gave? Are these evidence-based? Where did these ideas come from? How do you know they will work? You listed like zero co-payments. You talked about nominal financial incentives. Can you talk about where you got that from and why you think it would work?
Yeah, with permission, I would like to be able to follow up.
Great. I appreciate MedPAC's thoughtful analysis on this issue and so many issues within the Medicare program. Low-income Part D beneficiaries on tight incomes, there are many of them, and we must be doing all we can to ensure that they also have access to the medications that they need, while ensuring that there are not perverse incentives that keep drug prices high. I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Blunt Rochester. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Berrigan, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to follow up on the questioning from one of my colleagues on Medicare Part D negotiating. I know that you indicated that MedPAC has not taken a position on that. We had a hearing a few weeks ago. We had the drug manufacturers come in and PBMs come in. I had asked them if they were for or against a proposal to have a Medicare negotiate, and they were against it. Not surprising to many concerned about profits and so on and so forth. I'm really great to see in the committee that we are working on a bipartisan basis to bring down the price of prescription drugs. But having heard from my colleagues who sit on other committees for the VA and everything I've read, it seems to me that, and certainly for hearing from you, that you have no means to influence price. It seems to me that if that were lifted, it would actually provide some leverage for us to bring down the cost of prescription drugs to the American people. Has MedPAC done any type of study on how much money the American people would save if Medicare had the ability to negotiate drug prices?
MedPAC has not done its own independent assessment of the viability of direct negotiation between the Secretary and manufacturers. When others, such as our colleagues at CBO, have looked at this issue, they've determined that without the Secretary having very, very strong leverage, such as Medicare coverage or Medicare payment or other alternatives that have been proposed related to things outside of my purview, such as patent changes, that the Secretary is unlikely to achieve substantial savings through direct negotiation without being able to use those kinds of very strong negotiating tactics.
Can Medicare, can MedPAC do a study on this so that Congress has a report to look at and to look at these factors that you're discussing? Will MedPAC commit to doing something like that?
We could potentially look at some of the issues that would pertain to a direct negotiation scenario. So, you know, for example, would this be across the board, all drugs, all manufacturers? Does the agency have the resources to conduct these kinds of evaluations? What the evidence base is for the Secretary's ability to negotiate a given price? We could look at those sorts of issues in a qualitative way. I don't know that we would have the capacity to or the desire to second-guess our colleagues at CBO with respect to calculating potential savings.
Okay, well, anything you could provide to Congress would be helpful, especially because this has been a bipartisan issue, and a bipartisan basis seems like a way to move forward. So given that you work on a bipartisan basis,
yes,
I think any information would be helpful. Thank you for that. I want to chat quickly about the issue of minority health disparities across this country. you know, people based on race are treated differently in our healthcare system. They have different health impacts and outcomes. For example, HIV diagnosis rate among Hispanic men is more than 3 times the HIV diagnosis rate among non-Hispanic white men. African Americans are also more than twice as likely as whites to be diagnosed with and die from blood cancer and multiple melanoma. My district is majority minority. It's about 88% Latino African American. I have the highest rate of diabetes than any other congressional district in the state of California. And we touched a little bit upon low-income communities and how Medicare actually has low-income subsidies for patients. But the annual income is pretty low. I think it's about $18,735. In California, it's easy to miss that a little bit and then not qualify. And my concern is the connection between cost and the continuing impacts and effects on minority health disparities. Has MedPAC or CMS done any type of study to determine whether minority communities have similar outcomes from the Medicare Part D program as non-minority communities?
Not to the best of my knowledge.
Is that something you could do? I know you mentioned you do a lot of, you look at trade-off and balances, but you know, when we're talking about communities of color, racial health disparities is an issue. There shouldn't be really a trade-off or a balance with their health.
Understood. What you've outlined here is a fairly broad endeavor, though, and with all due respect, if you could grant me the leeway to go back and talk to my staff about what we can and can't do with the resources that we have available to us, we would certainly be willing to take a look at this.
Great, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Montana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Drug prices in the Medicare program keep rising, and it's making it tougher for seniors in Montana to afford their prescriptions. Dr. Matthews, last August, several members of the committee wrote to MedPAC and asked the commission to examine the trend of hospital consolidation and how much consolidation increases the cost to Medicare, the Medicare program and beneficiaries, including the costs of prescription drugs. So I want to focus on this issue today. Since we're discussing prescription drug prices, can you please update us on MedPAC's findings, specifically the impact of hospital consolidation and acquisition of physician practices on the cost of prescription drugs for the Medicare program and seniors' out-of-pocket expenses?
Yes, sir. So I don't have any update with respect to work we have currently underway in response to the most recent request. But as you know, a couple of years back, we did a chapter in a June report looking at the effects of consolidation on Medicare spending and looked at the impacts of both vertical integration, where different levels of the healthcare system form single entities, or horizontal integrations, such as where all cardiologists integrate under a single organization. And so both of those types of consolidation do have the potential to increase spending for the Medicare program.
So that request that we made, the work is still ongoing?
Yes, sir, that's correct. And we anticipate starting to roll that out in the fall of this year.
Okay, thank you. How do significant payment differences for identical medical services performed in Medicare at hospital outpatient departments versus independent physician practices impact seniors' out-of-pocket costs for Part B drugs?
It has the potential to substantially impact their out-of-pocket costs, but I use the word potential deliberately. And the reason I do that is because most Medicare beneficiaries in fee-for-service Medicare do have some secondary coverage. They are dual eligibles, they have employer-sponsored wraparound insurance, or they purchase Medigap. And so to some extent, they are insulated from the direct effects of these payment differentials across settings, but nonetheless, all Medicare beneficiaries are experiencing these effects through higher Part B premiums, and those beneficiaries who elect to purchase Medigap are paying higher Medigap premiums as a result.
Okay, and has MedPAC made any recommendations to address this differential?
We have. It's been several years now where we identified a set of services meeting certain criteria, that they are majority provided in physicians' offices, they are majority not associated with emergency care, and identified services that are appropriate candidates for a Medicare site-neutral payment policy.
Okay, and if Congress required Medicare to pay the same amount for services regardless of where they're performed, would seniors' out-of-pocket prescription drug costs decrease, and what effect would it have on Medicare overall costs?
Off the top of my head, I could not venture an answer with respect to the effects on their drug costs. It's something we could think about.
Okay, so that's something you could look into additionally, because this is the concern we hear back home is
Understood.
the overall cost, and prescription drugs are a big piece of that. So we very much appreciate your help to chart a path for us, and I thank you for your testimony today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Matthews, thank you for being here, and thank you for your testimony and sharing MedPAC's work on these important issues. As you point out in your testimony, there are a handful of expensive drugs driving spending in the Part B program, with consumers responsible for a significant out-of-pocket costs. The top 10 highest expenditure drugs accounted for about 43% of Part B drug spending in 2017, and all of these products are biologics. Some of these drugs have competitors and others do not. I'd like to learn more about the impact biosimilar entry into the market has had to date on the price of the originator biologics driving costs in Part B. You have shared what drugs the program is spending the most money on and the conditions these drugs treat, but how many of the top 10 highest expenditure drugs in Part B face competition from a biosimilar?
As I recall, there are 2 products out of that top 10 list that have biosimilar competitors, and the biosimilars have not had a substantial impact on the price that Medicare pays for the originator biologics. In part, this probably reflects the way Medicare pays for the biosimilars relative to the innovator biologic. The innovator biologic gets its own payment code and its own 6% add-on. The biosimilar gets its own payment code, even if it's at a lower price, but it gets the 6% add-on that is associated with the innovator product. So from the prescriber's perspective, the physician who administers the drug, it's a neutral decision whether to use the innovator product or the biosimilar. MedPAC has recommended that instead of those 2 products having unique codes, that you would potentially influence price to a much greater extent by combining them and having the program pay the average of the sales prices of those 2 products.
Okay. And I understand what you're saying about there's only been a modest impact on prices to date, and your recommendations for what we can do about it. Can you discuss how original biologics and biosimilars are currently grouped, and what the Commission has recommended to result in price reduction there?
Yeah, again, under current payment policy, the innovator biologics and each biosimilar get their own payment code. And again, in an attempt to make the decision financially neutral from the prescriber's perspective, the 6% add-on for any of those products is the add-on associated with the originator product. And so, again, our recommendation would be that instead of having, let's say, a $1,000 drug that gets a $60 add-on, and then a $100 drug or biologic that gets a $60 add-on, that instead we would average the $1,000 reference biologic and the $100 biosimilar and have Medicare pay that rate, which would give providers a much greater incentive to use the biosimilar and potentially start to move the price of the reference biologic down in a way that we have not yet seen.
Is there, as you've been sitting here, is there anything that we haven't asked you that you want to tell us?
No, ma'am, I do not want to venture any of my own questioning here. So.
Well, thank you. A major goal of this committee and our drug pricing work to date has been to remove the barriers to generic competition and stop anti-competitive practices. It's important for us to continue to examine policies that would support competition in all markets to lower costs facing consumers. Everyone should have access, as you know, to the care and medication they need. And thank you. And I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back, and I now would like to recognize the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
Thank you.
Happy birthday to you.
Well, thank you.
Thank God you were born.
Some people agree with that. Thank you. Dr. Matthews, really good testimony, so thank you very much, and really good work. It's really frightening, the cost of prescription drugs, and it's really frightening how the market power that is out there is so aggressively used, no matter how much pain is inflicted on folks. You know, I was here when Mr. Bhushan was raising some questions about a formulary, and a lot of people have that question, is that going to impede access? I was talking to Senator Grassley, he had that concern. And one of the approaches that we took in Vermont, because here's the dilemma as I understand it. If you have a strict formulary, you tend to get more savings, but less patient choice. But if you have a wide open formulary with patient choice, you get no savings. So how do you deal with that? And what we did in Vermont is we basically made it pretty easy for a doctor to override what the formulary was, because it might be that Mr. Bhushan or Dr. Bhushan and I have the same condition, but the medication that works for him is different than the one that works for me. I mean, is that a possible way to try to thread the needle here where we maintain patient choice but get the benefit where in the vast majority of time medication A is probably going to be good for Dr. Bhushan as well as good for me? Is that a possible path forward on this?
Potentially, and as I said in my comments earlier, we do think that there should be very robust exceptions and appeals avenues available for Part D enrollees and their physicians. But at the same time, you know, we're trying to balance the plan's ability to leverage price from the manufacturer.
Right, and I agree with that, but the fact is that there's going to be a lot of resistance if there's an apprehension that a patient can't get the medication he or she needs. So it's got to be simple, but the incentives that are built into the system right now that you outlined are totally in favor of higher prices. You know, if you can get somebody into the specialty drug program, then that's a real burden on the taxpayer. The patient has no clue, really, because we rely on what the doctor tells us. So I'd just urge us to try to look for some way where we address this patient choice issue, because I know a lot of my colleagues have that concern. I have that concern,
sure.
But we got to get the benefit of that formulary. Now, the other thing is we're the only government that I'm aware of that really doesn't play an active role in trying to provide some pricing protection to benefit our taxpayers and consumers. And you gave these shocking statistics about the specialty drugs and how a while ago, what was it, 33,000 people went immediately into
Yes, sir. That was in 2010. The number in 2017 is now 370,000.
Yeah, so it's one prescription gets them into that high taxpayer pay situation. Now, would you be supportive of legislation which would have price negotiation available as a tool for MedPAC, and in the event that that failed, have arbitration to come up with a price that is quote, fair?
Yeah, the commission has not weighed in on the broader question of direct negotiation. Our standing recommendation would include binding arbitration as part of our DVP proposal, which we recommended in 2017, and we are currently exploring whether or not binding arbitration could have a potentially greater role in the Medicare program. But we have not.
You could have that binding arbitration in some of the highest cost specialty drugs.
Yes, sir,
and
that's
then that would
correct.
have a huge impact on the cost to the overall, to the taxpayer and to the plans, correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Yeah, I mean, you know, again, I'm going to focus on Dr. Bhushan here a minute because I know what a dedicated physician he's been. We just have this dilemma. You just can't have it all. Okay, you just can't have it all. And the cost side on healthcare is where all the pain is. And if we just have these costs go out of control, continue to go out of control, that cuts off access. So there's got to be some trade-offs, is my view here. Would you agree with that, Dr. Matthews?
Yes, sir, it is all about trade-offs.
And there's some argument that's always made by the pharma companies that if there is some pushback on their pricing power, that somehow means they're not going to innovate. I find that to be bogus because they're spending more on advertising than they are on research. There's an enormous amount of research funded by taxpayers through the National Institute of Health. There's an enormous amount of research funded by taxpayers through the Research and Development Tax Credit. Do you see that if we had reasonable interaction by the government to negotiate prices or to have an arbitration system with neutral parties, that would impede innovation?
As we've contemplated binding arbitration, we do not believe that it would stifle R&D for true innovative new products where the manufacturer would have an opportunity to come before a neutral arbiter or arbitrator, I never know which the right word is, but present evidence in terms of R&D costs, in terms of foregone additional spending through the use of their product. And
you get some transparency out there.
Yes.
Again, Madam Chair, I think that's why this hearing is so important. I mean, this is not a he said, she said deal. We are all losing on this thing. So I appreciate that testimony and the good work you've done over years, and hopefully this committee can start moving forward to help bring these prices down. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and he yields back. And I also want to acknowledge, I think I was leaving the hearing room to run downstairs to the other hearing, and I did not get to wish our colleague, Congresswoman Robin Kelly, a happy, blessed, wonderful birthday, because you are all three. With that, I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soto, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. We saw in our committee analysis we're paying 104.3% average sales price to providers, down from 1.6% because of sequester. And we all realize this is an incentive to purchase drugs at a higher average sales price and receive a higher reimbursement. We saw CMS roll out a plan recently last year to have pharmaceutical vendors purchase and sell directly to patients, circumventing this provider cost escalation incentive, providing flat fees to providers, and tying reimbursements to international pricing. For my constituents at home, will this do the job, or are there other things we should be doing going along with what Congressman Welch talked about potentially arbitration or other ideas? What is MedPAC advising?
Okay.
Just broad points.
Yes, sir. So I'm not familiar with the proposal to have manufacturers sell directly to patients, if I understood your question correctly. So again, I would ask for the dispensation to come back to you on that point.
So basically it's saying allow private sector pharmaceutical vendors to buy and bill Medicare for drugs and supply those drugs to providers rather than the providers doing so directly.
Yes, so this is part of the IPI proposal that the administration has put forward. And again, while we do support the administration's desire to reduce the prices that Medicare beneficiaries pay for prescription drugs, particularly in light of prices that citizens of other countries are paying. But at the same time, we think there are certain logistical and implementation issues with respect to the administration's proposal that would make it less likely to succeed than.
What are those specifically?
So again, under the administration's proposal, Medicare would set a price that it will pay the vendor based on the international reference price. And it is incumbent upon the vendor to try and obtain that price from manufacturers. But the proposal, if I recall correctly, does not give the vendor much by way of negotiating tools in order to extract that price.
So that's where this arbitration idea that is being milled around in this committee
Yes, sir.
is so critical, because that could create a more arm's length transaction to get to the most efficient price. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I wanted to move into some other ideas pitched by HHS, particularly step therapy and prior authorization. Certainly with lesser conditions, these can be cost saving, but I worry when you apply it to cancer and other potentially fatal conditions that this step therapy and prior authorization, particularly step therapy, leads to time running out and people dying literally of cancer because they're giving less effective drugs earlier on in the step therapy, and that we end with a death that could have been prevented. How, do you think there should be a carve-out for cancer and other fatal conditions with regard to step therapy?
The Commission has not contemplated the need for a carve-out or exceptions based on medical condition or patient's diagnosis. But we have recognized, again, the need for a very robust and very expeditious exceptions and appeals process as part of the use of utilization management tools on the part of plans.
And going into another issue that we continue to see is in the private market, drug prices going 3, 4, 10 times the amount of increases. What role should we play in stopping this from happening, and how does that affect Medicare when we see a drug that's been around for 20 years that has a 10 to 20 times increase? What are you advising us to do?
Right, so that's actually an insightful distinction that if I could take a minute.
Sure.
So one, we've seen the entry of truly revolutionary blockbuster products on the market that cure things like Hep C, so the Sovaldes, the Harvonis, where the benefits of the medication potentially warrant the prices that the manufacturer is charging. But we also see, and the Commission is extremely concerned about, instances that you just alluded to where you've got products that have been on the market for decades where there is no real active research and development onto increasing the efficacy of these products, and yet the prices continue to increase year over year. And while there may be costs and R&D going on behind the scenes that people like me don't see, we still think that those kinds of cost increases are not warranted given our responsibility to a public program like Medicare. And so we have recommended an inflation rebate that would check the ability of manufacturers to increase their prices on a year-over-year basis in excess of some defined rate of inflation.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. It's a pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Matthews. Your testimony today has been excellent, and you're definitely going to get called back by many, many committees in the future.
I'm sorry to hear that.
You did a great job. I wanted to pick up actually right where Congressman Soto left off, because you mentioned this inflation rebate as a way of trying to get to some of these significant price increases. And it seems to me that arguably is the other side of a coin, where you could think about setting, or we could think about setting upper limits on the prices of some of these drugs. It's just a different way of accomplishing the same thing. Would you agree that those are sort of two sides of the same coin, potentially?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah. And I note that there's a number of states which have begun to explore regulating prescription drug pricing within their own jurisdictions. Maryland recently created, the Maryland General Assembly passed legislation. I think it's the first state to actually get this passed. It's now subject to the governor's signature, that would create a prescription drug affordability board. And the board would have the authority to review drug cost data that manufacturers submitted, and then they could set an upper payment limit on those prescription drugs. And I think there's 6 or 7 other states that are exploring the same sort of approach. We've talked about a number of strategies to address drug pricing. And we've also talked about how you've made recommendations on how Medicare can try to manage the situation downstream a little bit. If you view the original pricing that the manufacturers are setting as kind of the ultimate upstream point in the continuum, there's all these efforts downstream, bringing the plans in, trying to incentivize them more to manage costs so the program isn't taking as big a hit, et cetera. But if we go to the source, which is the pricing that the manufacturers are setting, there's increasingly, I think, a sense in this Congress on both sides of the aisle that we have to take some pretty dramatic steps to control the costs and the price setting at that end. What's your view of this concept of regulating or setting upper limits on the prices of these various categories of prescription drugs?
Okay, so again, the Commission hasn't taken a position with respect to setting a specific cap on a price, although I do see the analogy between setting a hard cap on a price versus setting a cap on the rate that a price can increase over time. I'm also not personally familiar with the details of the state efforts that you've just described, but it's something we can start to look at and see if there's any model there. But with respect to our inflation rebate, it's guided by the notion that for drugs that have been on the market for some period of time, where they are established therapies whose indications are known and their effects are known, that to some extent these are commodities, and the expectation of commodity prices is that they should go down over time. When you look at things like computers or widescreen TVs, you're getting better and better technology with each passing year at lower prices, and the question is why these trends work in reverse for prescription drugs, especially these therapies that are, again, long extant on the market. And so we think that at a minimum, setting a limit that those prices can increase year over year is a step in moderating these effects that we've seen that have very detrimental effects on the Medicare program.
Well, I think we need to put every option on the table. The rebate is I would say, a step in the right direction, the inflation rebate, but we need to be looking at negotiating power on the part of the Medicare program. Many have talked to that. The arbitration approach is another. Maybe some form of like public auction around the pricing of these drugs, and even the notion of regulating these drugs as a utility. I mean, if you look at, there's a lot of analogies you can draw between the public good aspect of how drugs are delivered to pretty much every American, and the way electricity is delivered or water is delivered, or healthcare premiums are set. So I think there's going to be a lot more activism on our part here in Congress with respect to the pricing of drugs. Thank you for your testimony today. It was extremely helpful. I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I'm going to recognize myself for an additional 5 minutes and also the ranking member as well for a couple of follow-up questions. First, Dr. Matthews, again, thank you. I think it's very clear that the committee, on a bipartisan basis, clearly has more than an interest in addressing drug prices. I would encourage MedPAC to go back and continue to make recommendations on how to protect patient access. I know that in the original legislation that created MedPAC, when Medicare Part D was created, so was MedPAC. But to leave out patients in this, I mean, this is not just a program where numbers are shifted around. The numbers apply to people, to human beings. And I don't see how that element can be left out of your deliberations. And as we work to reduce costs, that too has an effect on, as we've heard from questions and your responses, that too has an effect on patients. Now, this whole issue of step therapy, I don't see how MedPAC can just stick with what seems to me a conversation about tools and the kit, et cetera, when people have actually died because they don't have access to what they need. We can't ignore that, and nor can MedPAC. So while this step therapy has been created so that, as you describe it, more tools in the kit to reduce and control pricing and whatever, when people are dying because they can't get what they need and they're pushed back to step one, the doctor knows is not going to work. Step two, the doctor knows it's not going to work, but you never get to three because you haven't lived long enough. That doesn't make sense. It just doesn't. I mean, it's not defensible, in my view, and I think in other members' views as well. I don't know who supports this thing. It is from both sides of the aisle. You've heard about it. We've heard from our constituents. They don't identify themselves to us as Republicans or Democrats. They're our constituents. And the issue that you raised, that since the program was founded, was put together, that there has been a 20% increase in D, if I heard you correctly, a 20% increase on an annual basis relative to drug pricing is, to say it's a jaw dropper doesn't begin to describe it. And so I think we have our work cut out for us, but I think you do as well. And I think that MedPAC needs to step its game up, so to speak, in these areas, and that you do it in a timely fashion so that you can make recommendations and some of these changes be recommended in these key areas. With that, I would like to recognize Mr. Bhushan and thank him for his support of an additional 5 minutes for myself and for himself as well. Thank you again.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'll make a few comments about the step therapy and prior authorization. I mean, I've been a physician for many years, and this has been a concept that's waxed and waned for the 30 years or so that I've been in medicine. And you know, it's a concept that waxes and wanes because at the end of the day, I would argue it ultimately doesn't save anybody any money because it has the potential to delay therapy. And then as a cardiovascular surgeon, I saw people in tertiary care situations in their lives, and I've always had concerns about that. And I don't know if anyone has looked at the long-term implications of that, and it may not be, it's probably out of the scope of what you look at. But, yes, sir. But looking at delay in therapy, potential delay in therapy. And again, my argument that physicians generally will make the decision to treat their patients based on what they think is the best individual therapy for that patient. And do consider cost, don't get me wrong. As I mentioned, I'd considered cost if there was equivalent therapy. The one thing on the prior authorization, a number of years ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, there was one of the major private sector insurance companies that decided to drop their prior authorization program. Do you recall that at all?
I do not.
It might have been United Healthcare. I can't recall. And don't quote me on that, but I'm just, and then I think it's been reinstituted. And but the reasoning behind that, I remember when that happened is because they found that whoever this was, and I'm not saying it was them, I'm just at the end of the day, it didn't save them anything because they were authorizing about 98 or 99%, and the administrative costs to deny the 1 or 1.5% didn't outweigh the savings. Have you heard of that type of concept?
I've heard similar anecdotes. Again, I can't attribute them to a specific instance, but yes.
And I would argue that that's probably the case. The administrative costs, if you're going to, if you're going to deny 10% or something, I get that. I'd say that I'd have an ethical problem with that, but if you were, then it might save you money. I don't know what the finances are on that. But there's a perception that it saves money, and I'm not sure that that's actually true. So I want to comment, that's my comments on those two things. Do you know if CBO has ever done studies on out-of-pocket cost caps? Like, say, if there was a cap set at a certain level, what the CBO score would be? There'll be a score, right? Because there'll be a potential number of people that would go over, that would normally be over that level, whatever that cap is.
I believe that's correct,
and
yes.
Is that something that you think would be interesting to know for your purposes?
This would be for
Medicare Part D, like an out-of-pocket cost cap, right?
Yes, and this is something that MedPAC has recommended as part of our package of Part D recommendations.
Right. The question would be is what level that the out-of-pocket costs are capped at.
That is correct.
So the question would be is a CBO score on that at differing levels might be interesting information to know. Would you agree or disagree with that? Or have they done it?
I am not aware that they have done this, but I don't disagree that it would be an interesting thing to know the effects at different levels.
Because if Congress was going to say, okay, we're going to set an out-of-pocket cost capped at X dollars, right? The first thing we would do is get a CBO score,
right,
and see, well, what's that going to cost, right? Because there will be a cost if you set it low enough. There'd be a cost,
right?
And so maybe preemptively having a multitude of different cost levels known to Congress before we try to make some of these decisions could be helpful. Would you think that would be the case?
Without committing my colleagues,
I understand. I'm not asking
doing this work
for any commitment at all, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, I think that might very well be helpful. With that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Again, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Matthews, for your participation, and I hope that you didn't need to take any pain medication to come here today, or anything else due to your testimony. But the first time out, I think that that we would all say that you presented your case very well. I want to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witness who has appeared. We'll appreciate your timely response to those. Dr. Matthews and I, as I said, we really appreciate prompt responses to the questions that you may receive. So at this time, the subcommittee is adjourned.